Professor Besharov, who I'm meeting exactly 7 years after our last meeting here at the Senate of the Republic. Back then, in the presence of the Speaker of the Senate, Professor Besharov, as the chairman of the Peter Rossi Awards Committee, he gave the highest award for the first time to an Italian academician, Professor Martini. And I remember that moment very fondly, also because of the very fun way in which he was able to explain very complex concepts. And you were able to convey a message filled with calmness regarding a number of very technical things, a number of technicalities that could be very challenging to some interlocutors. At the time, we were discussing counterfactual methodologies in public policy assessments and in the foundations that these technicalities were based on, beginning in Latin America, then in the United States of America, then in Europe, and lastly in Italy. We were talking about the Senate's experiment regarding impact assessment as something very interesting, even from the institutional creativity point of view. So let me say that we are here again to re-meet an old friend, also thanks to Ms. Abagnale, who had constant contact with you, Professor. We'll be discussing evaluation and assessment, and this is taking place today in a very special moment in time. This is just a few weeks after I was appointed Secretary General, and the Council of the Presidency of the Senate, which represents all of the political parties elected to Parliament, and the Council approved a reform of our administration, and an office has been set up which will answer to the Secretary General, an office that will be focused on the impact assessment of public policies. And the director of this office, who is sitting on my left, will be delivering a keynote speech on the topic. Ms. Goretti is the one who will be delivering the keynote speech. And also want to thank her for all her work together with Ms. Abagnale. And I want to thank her for organizing this meeting today. Professor, we're still here. That's a good sign. Life is long, and it also represents a playful way with which we meet in these academic and institutional contexts. The last time we met in 2018, we were moving from one legislature to the other. It was a transition of sorts. It was a very special moment for Italy from the institutional standpoint. There had been a referendum that had been organized by the then majority. That referendum didn't pass, but that reform contained a seed of sorts, and it envisaged the evaluation of public policy as a competence that would be exclusively given to the Senate of the Republic. Since that reform wasn't approved through the constitutional reform, let me share some great news with you. Despite the fact that the referendum didn't pass, we continued to focus on the assessment of public policy within Parliament. In fact, it was revitalized following the approval through a referendum of another constitutional reform a few years later, which envisaged the reduction of our members of Parliament, following which the Senate of the Republic approved a second reform of its internal rules and regulations. Now, it's interesting to note that the rules and regulations of the Senate were inspired both by the fact that the first constitutional reform I mentioned was scrapped in 2017, but it was also revitalized by the coming into effect of that second constitutional reform I mentioned, which through the Senate structurally changed its internal rules. I also mentioned a more recent administrative step, which happened in 2024 on evaluation. The evaluation of public policy with that became a part of the Senate's rules and regulations. And its importance is immediately below the level of importance that the Constitution has. And it's in line with Article 64 of Italy's Constitution. Currently, the Senate's rules now mention the evaluation of public policies, which did not exist in the past, which means that there is a certain element of continuity. In a very special body, it's called the Committee for Legislation, Comitato per la Legislazione, which already existed in the Chamber of Deputies rules and regulations. And in the Chamber of Deputies, it has a very formal and textual and purely normative nature, without mentioning the noble fathers of the theory of pure law. So the two committees for legislation, the Chamber of Deputies and of the Senate, have a number of procedural differences, and they are also different in terms of the competencies they have. The Committee for the Chamber of Deputies bases its activities on the legislative drafting paradigm, whereas in the Senate of the Republic, although we also focus on drafting, but it also broadens the committee's competencies and also includes the evaluation or the impact evaluation of public policy. And furthermore, and we have some dear friends present today who I wish to thank, who played a major role in the history of our institutions and of our parliament, of all of our Republican institutions, in fact. I was mentioning that there's something even more to all this, and it's not surprising to me, I have to confess, although it's something I'm personally pleased of. Over the past 18 months, and this had never happened before, the evaluation of public policy started appearing in the parliamentary law texts. This had never happened before. It's included in the manual, in the text written by Mr. La Sorella, who's a member of the Chamber of Deputies. It's also mentioned in the text of Mr. Chaurro, who is a colleague here at the Senate, who was the co-author with Professor Di Ciolo of a text, and it was just recently published a few weeks ago, and it clearly states there's a reference to the evaluation of public policy, not just within the systematic elements of parliamentary law, but also within the framework of the role of Parliament within our institutional architecture. Now, you all know that the evaluation of public policies is only mentioned in a very limited number of constitutions. And we have to ask ourselves if in the struggle between Kilson and Weber, if the former or the latter would be right, who in the denial that what isn't said doesn't exist, or what the latter says when he says that although some things aren't written, there are some powers which do exist and which are then consolidated through practice. Now, of course, these are two intellectual giants, and therefore, personally, I cannot offer a solution to the question. But of course, it does give us an idea of the context that we are dealing with. Now, in the Senate, we started by studying the second president, despite the fact that he was the one who actually had power with the coming into force of the Italian Constitution. I'm referring to Luigi Einaudi. In his Prediche Inutili, his useless sermons, the phrase knowing to deliberate leads to the question, leads to the idea that poorly written laws are unenforceable and need to be corrected by other laws. He thought that we first have to know, then we have to deliberate. So again, he said that poorly written laws are unenforceable unless we correct them, unless we perfect them. Otherwise, everything would become a set of ideas and rules that are impossible to understand. And this brings to mind what Professor Besharov has been working on. And in 2017 and 2018, together with Professor Martini, said that the first thing we have to do when we want to assess public policy is we have to ask ourselves if the policy has been enacted, if it has been enforced. And with this initial step, with this initial idea, we started to find ways on how we could implement the National Recovery and Resilience Plan here in Italy, for instance. And we know that the enforcement, the application of a policy or of a rule is a recurring obstacle, not just in Italy, but in all state legislations. Professor Besharov said that the second step requires destroying the hypocrisy of our presumption of efficacy. And the jurists among us, or those who, as myself, have a legal background, know that the effectiveness of a policy is one thing from the legal standpoint, but it is something entirely different from the Weberian point of view. Efficacy is linked to the implementation of a policy or its enforcement. Now, these are two words which aren't present in constitutional law texts in Italy, although, from what I know, a text which will soon be published by Professor Balducci will have a reference to these concepts, implementation and enforcement. But the legal efficacy I was mentioning doesn't coincide with what Weber refers to as efficacy. Has a law led to certain effects? Has it reached the goals it had set out to reach? This is not a merely formal question. It isn't a juridical question. It is, in fact, a substantial question. It is a question linked to economic analyses. And by economic analysis, we do not wish to deviate from the Parliament's institutional path. In fact, quite the contrary. Our idea is to state that the Parliament is capable of being judged by the public opinion and by citizens, but it is also capable of judging itself and judging others, beginning with the government. Now, this is a cultural shift, which would appear to be a real turning point from juridical formalism to juridical substantialism. Has a president in the period from 1849 to 1850. Now, I recently worked on a report regarding parliamentary law in Italian texts over the past 200 years. This was a seminar I attended in Florence. And during that conference, I mentioned that in 1849, Professor Goretti drafted a parliamentary law manual in which he mentioned logics and philosophy within a purely legal context. And at the seminar in Florence, I mentioned that the strange thing is that Professor Goretti had also taught statistics. Now, just imagine a professor of philosophy or of constitutional law. Nowadays, it would be impossible for that person to teach statistics in any university. I think that's really surprising for those who are interested in law and those who are interested in economics. Back then, though, it happened. So what the Senate did was it organized a political office in 2015, the UVI, which was chaired by the Speaker of the Senate. So that after a training for all Senate officials through second-level master's courses, following knowledge-sharing experiences with other Italian and European institutions, but even with institutions in the U.S., thanks to your Appleman Association, thanks to which the Senate was able to participate in plenty of events. And it was no longer a matter of understanding whether or not we should have an impact evaluation program in Parliament. It was a matter of focus on which kind of impact evaluation we had to have. In 1997, in Latin America, in Mexico specifically, a program was launched titled Progressa. And for the first time, that program used counterfactual assessments to evaluate public policy for the very first time. Now, it's interesting to note that that same year, 1987, some very well-known scholars, Paulson and Tilly, published a report in which, from their point of view, they proved how useless any experimental evaluation was. And that happened that same year. In the U.S., in 2003, the development of impact evaluations especially with counterfactual methodologies, happened for so-called welfare. In literature, in 2008, thanks to the impulse of the network created by Professor Besharov, Professor Martini, who was awarded 10 years later by Professor Besharov, published a paper in which he proved in very pragmatical terms the strategic importance of impact evaluation with counterfactual methodologies. Now, what we mean by counterfactual is that we want to answer the question, what would have happened had a certain public policy not been enforced? This, of course, is a very hot topic in Europe, especially when we refer to so-called zero cost. In other words, what would happen without a European provision? Now, this question would appear to be very simple, but it also leads to very complex reasoning. And the Senate, with its Office for Impact Evaluation, stated that it does not want to replace a political evaluation. In fact, within Parliament, our intention is to allow the political world, the political parties, to be aware of what they are deciding on. And therefore, this counterfactual model leads to a crossroads of sorts, a choice between technicalities or methodologies on the one hand, the classic random trial approach with a perfect compliance, and on the other, with an alternative which is still very much a part of the counterfactual model, with methodologies based on observational data rather than data which is observed. And let me explain what I mean by that. Now, by definition, the counterfactual model cannot be based on evidence, whereas an impact assessment tries to evaluate public policies through evidence or based on evidence. That doesn't mean that by looking into one another's eyes we can understand that there's an interaction in this very moment. The point is that through methodologies, even without our physical presence, we can actually understand the cause behind the gaze between ourselves. So it's not based on observed data, but on observational data, which have to support non-testable hypotheses, but which are very strong nonetheless. And this requires the development of skills which cannot be improvised. I myself am fascinated by this world, although I recognize that I myself cannot make an assessment based on observational data or through experiments, which is the first hypothesis of counterfactual methodologies, because I don't have a specific and high-level background, which is absolutely necessary, because otherwise, instead of being a tool, an impact assessment can simply turn into chit-chat, and that's something we have to avoid. And at that point, Luigi Einaudi would have defined them as being useless sermons, whereas his sermons were more than useful for all of us. And therefore the Senate, through its Office for Impact Evaluation, which is now supported by a political body, the Committee for Legislation I mentioned earlier, which, differently from the same office in the Chamber of Deputies, also has to evaluate the impact of public policy, besides having another office, which is directly in contact with the Office of the General Secretary, and we have to ask ourselves, how can we conduct the impact evaluation of our public policies, despite the limited resources we have, with our human resources, who over the past 3 years has attended master courses and plenty of training sessions. So the first thing we have to do is we have to be able to read and understand the impact assessments drafted by experts, so that what Professor Besharov refers to can become something truly useful to all institutional players, and not just to the experts. And that's why the impact evaluation for the Senate, which has to be conducted ex ante, before the approval of legislation, or ex post, meaning after the approval of legislation, or in itinere, during the path leading to the approval of legislation. In each of these instances, the ultimate meaning would be entirely different. An ex ante evaluation, interpreted by the Senate of the Republic, has become a possible evaluation, a forward-looking evaluation, because it comes before the approval of a specific law, without having a contradictio in terminis, in translating an ex ante evaluation into something else. And the ex post evaluation isn't an evaluation which looks to the future. In fact, it is a retrospective of sorts. In other words, it looks to the events which happened before. There is a word we have in Italian which is quite ambivalent. And it has been studied at length by major institutional figures, Professor Andreatta, for instance, or Professor Martini. Both of whom try to define the word politica, politics in Italian, which is very ambiguous, trying to define the difference between politics and policy. When we evaluate public policy, do we look to politics or policies? To the latter. And even more.
Does it just consider the literal meaning, or rather, does it consider the design behind a legislation. So the content that takes shape in its practical effectiveness, not just in abstract terms. And jurists, in this case, rather than economists, for a long time have called it effectiveness. This led to a change in the documentation that is produced by the Senate. Such documentation has to be, first of all, understandable. And I apologize with the professor, also understandable in terms of some inevitable difficulties. Language difficulties in specialist studies. So it is important to resolve through an understandable language that does not detract from precision, but makes the sophisticated work understandable or usable to decision makers, whether the parliament or the government or whoever is called to verify, to check the impact of their own choices. So the documentation that is written in a different way hides even a broader audience of recipients. The recipients of the assessment of public policies, are they just the decision makers? Primarily, it's the decision makers. But how many times have we read, since the studies that were also ethically very important, that Professor Besharov disseminated on very important themes linked to childhood? And still today, they are milestones in our reflections and meditations. So I wish to repeat, to what extent and how much should we avoid a wrong perception, a misperception of the effects? And in order to avoid a misperception of the effects leading to consider something fake, not because of fake news, and this is a phenomenon thanks to which the literature could be really examined. But it is important to reconstruct facts that are correlated to well-founded causes. So, because effects sometimes are considered as deriving from a cause, and they are not. So the recipients are no longer just decision makers, but they are also citizens. So our office, over time, has started a methodology that is complementary and necessary for the assessment of public policies, the so-called public consultations. Such consultations are intended to put together what was separate in the beginning. So decision makers and recipients of the public policies. So after so many years in Florence, a professor approached me and he told me, so here we can say we were defeated. The assessment of public policies had ups and downs. I reminded a few dates, 1997 onwards. But now it seems that the attention is waning on the assessment of public policies. So we might wonder, was it just an effort, intellectually sophisticated but useless, that actually made our intellect happy, but our drafting activity was useless? Or is it still useful somehow? Among those that the writer Umberto Eco defined the apocalyptics and on the other, the so-called integrated people. But declaring clearly, stating that he had strong perplexities on the approach advanced by Lawson and Tilley, we may think of a paradigm of institutional realism. And we should acknowledge that today the assessment of public policies is the foundation of the new European economic governance. Accordingly, it is a fundamental step in terms of the dialogue and the relations between member countries and European institutions. We often hear about the so-called relations, or and there is an important, we often hear about reports, and there is an important report on competitiveness. But that report requires a dialogue between institutions using methods and languages that are consistent. And the language of the European economic governance is the language of the impact assessment of public policies. So it is not a romantic attempt to recover fascination that in my case might be regarded as the fascination of adolescents. This is insisting on the assessment of public policies. Rather, it is a necessity for institutions. And in order for such assessment to be accepted as such, we need to generate an osmosis between institutions and academia, education. Today, an important process that you have implemented through a number of steps is ending, and it ends in this context within a parliamentary body. So it is not by chance. This is the deep meaning of this process that you started, of this journey. So from being self-referential, from being abstract, there is a shift to relying on a concrete dialogue that is the foundation for new hopes. Thank you so much for your attention.
Well, so impressive. So, Mr. Secretary General, Dr. Goretti, yeah. And to my dear friend Gloria Avignelli, thank you for having me here. I'm honored. I very much appreciated your comments. Alberto Martini has been a friend of mine for 20 years, almost 25. As you may know, he spent almost 20 years in the U.S. And he was a senior researcher there before he came back to Italy. His crusade was rigorous counterfactual. And that was so important when he started, and so important now. But I think as we talk about these things, as your comments reflected, we have to have a broader picture of the analysis we're doing. I apologize, I'm going to use the American terms, and good luck with translators. But we say policy analysis is the umbrella. And policy analysis is, what is the question? Do we dare to ask the right question? And I will only talk about the questions we try to answer in the US. But we are in a challenging time, much more than simple randomized trials. Beyond that now. We go to the question of the counterfactual, but much more broadly speaking. For the US, the questions start with a changing economy that has left many people behind, and it has had massive political impact. We have a new president because there are so many people who were left behind. And failure of policy analysis has been to not consider all the citizens, but just the average. Al Gore, the vice president, used to say, yes, the pool is only 6 meters or 5 meters deep on average. At one end, it's 3 meters, 2 meters. At the other end, it's 20 meters. And so some people are left behind. And the challenge of our time is to help those people. And doing that requires asking the right questions without fear for what the answers might be. In the US, big questions are, what do we do about immigration? How do we incorporate so many people who want to come to our country and your country and Western Russia and the Gulf states? You can go all over. This is a movement. The Gallup organization does a poll every 5 years. 1.5 billion people, 1.5 billion want to move. That's 3 times the population of Europe. So we face this challenge. We face a challenge also, I know you don't have this problem, of declining birth rates. We are a little bit below replacement. Italy, I think, is 0.8, something like that. This is also a challenge. It's a challenge to our public pensions. It's a challenge to our healthcare systems. We are now at, in the US, almost 20% of our gross national product is healthcare. Now, if you want my 2 cents, spending 20% on healthcare is better than spending 20% on TikTok. But the political system's not ready for that. We have a challenge to retool our workers, men and women, who did factory work, where the factory work now is disappearing or being taken over by robots. And for that, the question, the policy question is, how do we do job training? And to whom do we give the job training? In the States, we are sometimes too nervous to say, not everyone can be trained. Some people may be in their 50s or 60s. We have to accept that they're not going to work, and we have to protect them. But that's the policy analysis question before we get to how we help them. We have to be willing to say these people may not be productive for the rest of their lives, but we need to support them. This becomes more complicated. Mr. Toniato, you mentioned cash transfers. This is the idea that is going worldwide. You have a program here. The European Union is promoting these programs. We in the United States have a version of this. We do it in our tax law. But so much of what we do with the cash transfers requires now an evaluation, implementation evaluation, and effectiveness evaluation. The implementation evaluation is who gets the money? Does it go smoothly? And how do we decide, do we give this money once a year, once a month? In the US, a big challenge, and I have to say this with very great care, but a big question is, we have this check. Do we give it to the couple, the husband and the wife, if they're married? Do we give it to the wife alone? I've been married many, many years, but I know the effect of where the money goes. So these are challenges that only evaluation. We can have philosophical discussions. The man is the head of the house. The woman is the keeper of the house. Who knows? But we need to study the implications of how we provide the money. And we have to ask the question, what is the effect of giving money to work? Does it encourage work? Does it discourage work? Does it raise, for us, the English word is reservation wage? Does it mean that people will only work at higher salaries? Or will they take the money and they work informally? These are evaluation questions. They are philosophical questions, but they are actually, we study how people respond. The politicians can ignore us. They can disbelieve us. And by the way, that's a very important issue in the US. We don't have just one office of evaluation. We have thousands. We have advocacy groups. Everyone has an evaluation. You want to take a position in the United States? You can get an evaluation that agrees with your point of view. So this is a challenge. The English word is weaponization of research. And it happens. And we have to be prepared for that battle, which will take place. There are ways that the government can help. We do many consultations at the European Union level. 2 years ago, we did a joint consultation between what we call the specialized analytic units of the EU and the US. And we should probably do it with the Italian units as well. But we did it with the European Court of Auditors. We did it with of all things, the European Investment Bank, because they actually have a very powerful voice in what happens. The European Parliamentary Research Service. So the directors of those offices came to the US and met with the equivalents of the US agencies. And it was quite interesting. This was just after COVID. It was getting better. And the conversations were very similar. However, as always, the United States was ahead of the game, always. We probably, through fraud, overspent maybe $500 billion US. Trillion. The equivalent number for the European Union is maybe 50 or 70 million euros. So we have a giant problem, us, not you, in developing systems to give money out quickly, but honestly. And that we are failing on, by the way. That is an evaluation question, a policy question, and people don't want to ask that question yet. They don't think it's going to happen again, but it will. So there are all these sit everywhere, these kinds of questions. Another big one, I'm just giving you thoughts. Another big one is what to do with people who are in the informal economy. Uber drivers, people who work on TikTok and all this and all that. They don't pay into the social insurance system in the US. They don't pay unemployment. They don't pay any of that. And yet, when the economy crashed, the US government paid them unemployment, covered their rental, even though they had not contributed to the trust funds. I think this is the case in some European countries. For us, it's a big challenge. We are trying to decide how we deal with the growing informal economy, for whom people are not making contributions to the broader social trust funds and so forth. Well, this is indeed a challenging time. We at the University of Maryland, we have a small little part of this. We train the policy analysts of the future. I'm almost done. It's okay. And you can see what a great job my generation did. So it's up to them. What we teach at the universities in the US, there are maybe 150 schools that do policy analysis, they're called public policy, and they do policy analysis, they do implementation and management, and they do evaluation. So this is the whole package. We turn out, there are probably, I don't know, I think maybe 10 or 15,000 students in the US every year who graduate with those credentials. The course that brings me here today, raise your hands, hello, 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 oh, come on, yeah, is a course on the implementation of programs, the monitoring of programs, and the measurement of their implementation. We also teach a course on the evaluation of programs. We teach that in June. That's at the OECD, and then in Brussels and Luxembourg. Here we try to learn, and we come to Italy not just for the pasta, but because you offer something very special. From the Senate on to the individual programs, we learn from what is happening here. We were at the Ministry of Economics and Finance on Wednesday, and we had long sessions about the implementation, the monitoring, and the evaluation of the Resilience Fund. And we have so much to learn from you on that. I want to tell you, and I mean here in the US in general, we have our equivalent of the Resilience Fund is something called the block grant, but the money goes out with almost no requirements, with no requirement that there be outcome measures that are measured, let alone effectiveness. So we largely give the money to our states, and there are many lessons to be learned by how it's done in Europe. So we come here in part because one of the most advanced programs that I know of is at the ministry. And I understand from Chiara that also from the Prime Minister's office, but I'll say the ministry. So we were there. Many of our students are interested in education and the monitoring of education services. So we were at Anvalsi and Anvor yesterday. And for us, the most striking thing is that you have a national measure of how your students are doing in ways that we somewhat have, but not nearly with the fine grain that are here. My own sense, by the way, is we don't use those data enough. I'm sure there are political reasons why we can't. In the US, the differences in achievement are heavily driven by demographics and family income. It is quite striking, and I apologize if I overspeak. The definition of an expert is someone who comes from more than 50 kilometers away and has a pointer. Well, I don't have a pointer, so I'm not an expert, but it's quite striking. I say this as a visitor, to see the distinctions by the north and south of Italy. We have the same problem, but not north and south. Ours is more within each region and within each city and so forth. But these divisions are the challenge of the 21st century for my country. So I mentioned that as we move forward, there will not be just one evaluation, there will be competing evaluations. In other countries, for example, in Great Britain, the political parties have their own evaluation centers now. And surprise, surprise, the evaluation from Labour Party says this, the evaluation from the Tories says that. I thought this was science. It is science, but it's easy to adjust it a little. So the challenge for us, who think we are more objective, and we all come with our own biases, but the challenge for us is to create consumers who can interpret and judge these evaluations and can help us choose what's good or bad about all of them. I think the only things I would say to end, and I'm just reflecting on what the Secretary General said, transparency is very important. To say the evaluation says A or B is not always persuasive. To explain why the answer is A or B is much more persuasive. So the methods have to be transparent. I have a point of view about that. As you suggested, the randomized trial is, they used to call it the gold standard. Whether it's the gold standard or not, regression analysis is a very limited tool. It's too easy, it's too difficult to understand and too easy to manipulate. So what I teach is the importance of pre-post, comparison group, interrupted time series, right? These things politicians can understand and the public can understand. We did this and then this happened. Now, if it happened right away, yes, I mean, there are big arguments. Why did inflation happen? Well, we spent a lot of money, demand went up, or it was because of COVID. So sometimes these are not answers, but transparency is giantly important to win the public policy evaluation argument. I said it before, the Secretary General said it. When I looked at the criteria for the Resilience Fund, more than half of the monitoring is implementation. So implementation is the second thing I would say is as important as evaluation. There are so many examples. There was a project in Africa to help the local people build latrines. The evaluators came after a year and a half, and there were no latrines, bathroom, toilets. So the first thing they wanted to do was blame the people in the village. It turned out that the development agency didn't send shovels. There were no shovels. So the implementation, right? This is implementation. We didn't do that. Other programs, the teachers don't come to class. So implementation is very important. I mentioned this when I started. Asking a question that can be answered is also very important. If we ask global questions, we may not get answers. So the global issue that the world faces is the decline in births. And maybe the mistake is to think each country's story is different. But the decline in births is in Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Russia, the US. The only continent that will have an increase in births is Africa, and that's expected to slow down in the next 50 years. So the human race is shrinking. And there are many studies now beginning to ask the question, what do we do about it? Many of those questions will not be decided while anyone in this room is alive, unless you all live to be 100 and something. but we can begin to explore them. In my country, I am quite sure that the way we provide welfare payments, payments for the poor, discourages marriage because it is based on the income of the couple. So if they get married, their income goes up and they get less benefits. If they just cohabit, they get the benefit and they're more wealthy by not marrying. Now, this is my opinion. There's research goes both directions, but it's quite striking that the decline in marriage coincides. Notice I'm not doing causality yet, but it coincides with the people who are in this marriage penalty trap. So asking questions that have an easier answer than why do we not have children, but asking, do our social programs generate this? Is there something about the labor force? These are all separate issues. That's the third thing I would say. And my final point, everyone in this room is perfect, but sometimes it's good to evaluate the evaluators. Anyway, thank you very much for having me.
That was a real keynote speech by the professor. His ability to synthesize was just as good as his ability to be profound and deep. So thank you very much for this lecture you delivered to us free of charge today at the Senate. And we will cherish this lecture and we'll translate it not into Italian, but into a language that can allow all of us to treasure it, because the things you said were a real treasure. So thank you very much, dear professor. And I want to excuse myself with our friends who are here today, who are the future evaluators. And you'll excuse me if I'll have to leave after Ms. Goretti takes the floor. This is due to an institutional engagement. I have to leave with the Speaker of the Senate on a trip abroad. But let me just say that we will continue to have a very deep bond in continuity with the things we've done in the past. And therefore, thanks to Ms. Goretti and through Professor Besharov, in the future you'll continue to be in contact with myself and with all of our colleagues here, and all the colleagues that Professor Besharov thanked so kindly, and I share his gratitude, of course, because there really needs to be a continuity in the thoughts we share, in our relations. And I think we can all become stronger through this common path of ours. We have to be inclusive and not exclusive. Dear Chiara, I think you're the right person to try to answer who has to evaluate the evaluators. Over to you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here today. I want to thank Gloria for having organized this initiative. I want to thank the Secretary General for his support. It's not just a pleasure to be able to talk to young people, especially if they are the future evaluators, the future policy analysts. And it's also an opportunity to talk about some of the things that inspire me in my new position as Director of the Office for Impact Evaluation, Public Policy, and Administrative Action. Now, this is a task which is truly daunting. Those of you who are familiar with evaluation know how difficult it is to measure and evaluate public policy. And the two previous speakers outlined some of these concepts. And within the framework, within the context of Parliament, these profiles are applied to all of the public policies implemented by a state. So this includes plenty of different topics, methodologies, and intervention. It truly is a daunting task. Let me just say a couple of things regarding my background. I received plenty of training in the Senate, and the Parliament is, in fact, the right place to blend politics and policies. I'm not so much concerned by the differences between politics and policies. The policies that we evaluate, the ones we examine, hopefully will end up being at the very core of the political decisions, the politics. And therefore the two blend whenever there is an informed political decision in Parliament. Now, I began by focusing on financial profiles. I have a background as an expert in budget. And then I started branching out into various types of analyses, sectoral analyses, from the budget office to territorial offices to incentives. And all of these different aspects, these different sectors, understanding the impact of policy, have to begin by understanding the policy itself. We have to cover its implementation, and we also have to conduct an ex post analysis, which can lead to a possible review or to a possible amendment of what has been done. Now, I covered different profiles, as I mentioned, and I also had a truly extraordinary experience at the presidency of the Council of Ministers. I was in charge, I was a coordinator of the Recovery and Resilience Facility. And as a professor mentioned earlier, that was a groundbreaking innovation, and I'll try to explain in just a few minutes what it is. And it was truly extraordinary for the way in which a number of European countries worked, with a focus on results. And it's very different compared to how we had used European community funds up to that time. It was more focused on expenditures and not so much on results. So the difference between an expenditures program and a results program is something which has now become a very important part of our public debate and in our administrative discussions. Now, one of the questions that you have been asked during your course is what is the role of performance and measuring performance in the Italian system? Now, the Secretary General mentioned a number of very important experiences in his remarks. Italy is part of a group of countries which belong to a dominant juridical culture. In a comparative analysis, in a very superficial way, we're different from common law countries, in which the evidence-based approach is more widespread in decision-making processes. So Italy is a country which doesn't feel at ease with evidence, with numbers, in terms of its administration. It isn't used to collecting information. Now, I don't want to look for any correlations, since we are talking about evaluation and analyses. Often political decision makers, after adopting a policy or after adopting a budget, they don't consider how the implementation process continues. They don't even think about whether or not resources have been spent. Now, I was surprised a few weeks ago to find out that a budget destined to innovative drugs hadn't been fully spent. There was a part of that sum which was still a part of the Ministry of Health's budget. Now, this discovery happened following a request submitted by a member of parliament who wanted to increase that fund, taking into account the impact assessment of these drugs and their effect on health. So basically, there was an impact assessment, although the administration still hadn't included within its activities the fact that the result of this innovative drug was so important that more had to be spent to promote that drug. So basically, we wanted to increase spending without understanding that the amount we had allocated hadn't been fully spent. There are some reasons behind that, but I don't want to get into too many details as to why that happened. Moving on to how we can promote measurement, how we can focus on a culture of evidence. And that can help us understand how difficult it is to implement this model. I'd like to go back to what was mentioned earlier by the Secretary General when he referred to the ex ante, in itinere, and ex post approaches. In other words, the evaluation spiral. The fact that you have a policy which is then assessed as to its effectiveness. Then we ask ourselves if that initial question is still valid and if the policy can be improved or if it has to be changed because the initial question is no longer a priority for political decision makers. Now, if administrations aren't used to dealing with numbers, which is what I said earlier, I feel that is due to a reason which doesn't lead to the sparking of this evaluation spiral, which means we don't have enough data, we don't have enough adequate data to lead to the evaluation. Now, we talk about evaluating public policy beginning with the evaluation of administrative data. And if the administrative data isn't collected appropriately, if the data we collect is too raw or too rough, if it's incomplete, it makes it difficult to perform the evaluation. And in Italy, from this point of view, and we're aware of this, of course, we have inherited a certain degree of cultural obsolescence, which is due to a number of different reasons. And we can go into this later if you want. We have a very high age when it comes to public sector workers, or we don't see data as something which belongs to the administration which produces the data. The administration's linked to public policy. It's almost as if there is a desire to hold on to an information monopoly for each individual public administration. Plus, as I was saying earlier, we don't think that collecting administrative data is something which can then be used to perform assessments or evaluation. This is something that I discovered while I was working at the presidency of the Council of Ministers, and it was quite surprising to me. Most of our databases are made up of questionnaires. We have administrative data which can be understood if we observe the administrative actions, but we don't have a direct way of obtaining that information. Basically, whenever we need information or data, we have to send a request to each individual public administration if we want to understand how much real estate they own or how many people work for them. These are just examples, of course. This leads to a huge degree of bureaucracy. Sometimes we don't receive an answer from them. There may be mistakes in filling out the forms and sending the information. if I ask for information on real estate, for instance, and somebody has to physically insert the number 10 and they make a mistake and they write 11, that means that we have rough information or wrong information or partial information. And all of this information isn't shared by each individual piece of our public administration. By sharing that information, of course, we'll be able to improve things. Another example of what we're trying to deal with, thanks to technology, is the fact that many government reports, many government collection efforts are forwarded to Parliament in PDF files. They used to be paper-based. Now we use PDF files. Although the data isn't open, it cannot be downloaded and it cannot be processed. Obviously, as you understand, it's difficult. It's very difficult to improve our evaluation methods if these are the things we have to deal with. If we want to promote quality data, if we want to integrate our databases, we really have to change things. This has to be one of the priorities for our new office. As I was saying, I was able to improve my skills by working for the Senate. I was able to become a mediator of sorts between different administrations. And I'm working to integrate the data available because, as we know, data is essential if we want to have advanced impact assessments of public policies. An example of what we want to do is the work we're doing with the fact-finding committee for safety on the job. So basically, we want to start using the database of INAIL, which is the national insurance body for labor, and we want to analyze their data when it comes to accidents on the job for subcontractors in this case. And by cooperating with them, we want to try to deal with the very high level of accidents on the job in certain construction sites, for instance. Now, obviously, we can only be successful if we merge the two data centers, the two databases, and if we can match the different codes and the different information they contain. So things are changing. I mentioned that we have a very difficult starting point, but the things are starting to change. And one of the ways in which we're changing our system is with the National Recovery Fund. And now, before COVID, nobody believed that we could actually change the funding model we have so swiftly. Nobody believed that we could have such a strong European funding method. The professor was mentioning block grants earlier. And I was thinking that that we had to implement the recovery fund through conditional grants. The funding which begins from the federal level, which is then given to states, upon condition that they be used in a certain sector. Maybe it covers both of these models. What I mean by that is that it is assigned to a certain sector because the National Recovery Fund requires that resources be allocated in a certain way, but they also have to produce a certain result. We had to deal with plenty of cultural difficulties. It was the very first time for the public administrations who had responsibility for these programs, and they had to rethink what their role was. In the past, they had never thought about what results they had to achieve as a final result. think of the program for the renovation and for the safety of the schools. Of course, the procedure was complete. Resources were given to municipalities. But nobody ever assessed whether or not the municipality would actually renovate the school. The administration managing the funding initially simply wasn't interested in assessing the results. So basically, with the National Recovery Fund, we were forced to rethink things, to reprogram things, because of course monitoring requires programming. We have to understand what it is we're monitoring, in this case, the final outcome, which means that if I want to assess whether or not I am working within the deadline set for me, if I want to achieve my goals within the deadline, I have to have a timeline. I have to understand what needs to be done and when it needs to be done, how decrees have to be implemented, how resources have to be allocated, the public competitions, the tenders, and how we have to monitor the various phases of the project. So we need a timeline, and we also need indicators that can help us assess whether or not the timeline is complied with. Now, what did Parliament do as far as the National Recovery Fund is concerned? Well, unfortunately, Parliament limited itself to a formal analysis of administrative acts. So if we go back to the slide, which made a comparison between evaluation, which isn't irrelevant. In fact, it's important to have full understanding of a legislative text. So that did happen, but maybe there were some shortcomings in terms of timelines and assessing results. That could have been improved. But we also have another step, which is the new European governance. In other words, the European Union saw the results it got from this program based on results, and it decided to translate that into a new governance model. So not only do we have a governance which asks us to go back to policies that can help us monitor our expenditures, and monitoring those expenditures are conditioned by other investments which are drafted in the very same way in which the national recovery funds are drafted, which means that we have to continue reasoning in terms of public policy. And this is a major change for Parliament, because it has to reason in terms of policies. Its commissions are based on sectors, but it seems to be limited in its sphere of action. And out of the 24 measures which are included in Italy's budget law, 3 of these measures refer to an impact evaluation for policies. There is a conditionality based on the impact evaluation. And these types of conditionalities will require the various administrations to come up with models that can support the implementation of the policy itself. So basically, in conclusion, with this new task that I have, we want to make sure that the Senate can be able to assess what it does. Now, the Office for Impact Evaluation has paved the way. It's done an excellent job so far. And what we need to do now is act as mediators. The professor was referring to the questions we need to answer. So we have to mediate between the question and the answer. Answers which often don't deal with the political question. It basically answers an academic curiosity. It may sound drastic on my part, but we need to really strengthen our ability to assess policies and assess our results. Making it not very useful policies. Now, we need to be able to translate the policy questions. That's the role the administration has. That's the role our colleagues have. So basically, we have to make sure that those policy questions can receive the support from those who are capable of evaluating. We need to be able to understand what profile we're analyzing. I'll leave it at that, and I'm available for any questions you may have. Thank you.
Allora, permettetemi prima.
Before leaving, please allow me to address you as the new friend of our Senate. So I would like to thank you, and I'd like to just refer to all the people here. You know that number one is it's not only yours, but our Professor Besharov, because rather than adopting him, he has become part of our family. So we got hold of Professor Besharov. I don't know whether he realizes that, but he is our Professor Besharov, not just your Professor Besharov. So I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to Professor Besharov and a round of applause. And I would like to share with you who is going to support you in this journey. I cannot mention everyone, and I apologize for those I'm not going to name. The Senate, it is not just the Senate that is represented here. As I mentioned in the beginning, I wish to thank a colleague of ours who is honoring us with his presence. He was the Deputy Secretary General of the Chamber of Deputies. He was also an advisor to the Court of Auditors, was the Secretary of the Constitutional Court. So it's really a great signal that in this closed-door seminar on the assessment of public policies, a personality, I have just shared with you his biopic. I mean, he's here not only to listen to the speakers, but to meet you. And you may think that here we have just the people who were coerced into attending the meeting. Instead, we have someone here who is legibus solutus, a retired person. So he has no, there was no necessity, no obligation for him to come here. And there are Secretary General that was not able to come here for organizational reasons, because the Senate has to keep working. But we have two more Secretaries General, Dr. Sassoli from the first area, Dr. Goretti from the third area. So you find here the administration represented as a whole and in an authoritative manner at very high levels. My colleague, Mrs. Goretti, mentioned an inquiry committee, and I'd like to spend a moment on this. Never before an inquiry committee had ever used the tools of impact assessment. In the previous legislature, and we have here Director Picardi, Mrs. Magalotti, and Mrs. Lucioli. We have also the committee for femicide. They tried to study the legal documents and legal proceedings. And they were not collected in an orderly manner. So it was impossible to use them for impact assessment. And the sorting criteria were then used within that inquiry committee. And we are talking about femicide, which is a really thorny issue. So in this legislature, the injuries committee or accidents in the workplace committee is now following the road that was laid down by the previous legislature. So being able to shift from an office that is targeted to assessment to an activity going beyond the legislation and even beyond, because it performs an inquiry. This is a very important cultural leap. So on one hand, it exposes very marked oppositions, and then in a way restores a fabric that allow to deep dive into the causes of the phenomenon. And here you find also many directors of service departments, and I would like to thank them all for being here. They deal with very diverse themes, from design for the next 40 years of the new buildings, or rather of these buildings that you are going to visit, because they are absolutely marvelous. So in order to design future actions, they use assessment methodologies. We can remember that in Austria, parliament buildings were closed for many years. They were demolished, and then they had to be rebuilt. So this might be the question. Are we going to demolish them, or are we going to use them building based on slices? So I have Mr. Crochet here. So there has to be a reflection upstream. What is the most suitable tool to achieve a specific result that I have in mind? And we also have here Mrs. Abagnale, Mrs. Goretti, and I wish to thank them for their passion and determination in their remit, where the Parliament shows that it really is ahead of the game compared to other institutions. So you played a role of liaison, because you explored, you investigated, and at the same time you disseminated to all the officials what you were able to learn in your journeys. I'm going to mention just a few of the participants, but I can see your faces in my colleagues, and I wish to think that there are personalities like yours that over time you may have seen Boschi, Lambiasi, Zito, and so on and so forth. They would have liked to steal your professors and disseminate their knowledge at all the levels of the administrations. It's like with yeast, where it is possible to grow something out of nothing, or to grow something which is bigger. Mrs. Goretti used the word, and when she used that word, Professor Besharov nodded. Watch out on this point. Their schools, their backgrounds are not the only ones. If you use the word indicators, which is a magic word, a magical word, and quite popular in the specialist literature. Do not tell this to a friend of Professor Besharov, because if you use the word indicator with Professor Martini, he gets mad, because to him, who is the purest among all of us, the word indicator betrays the centrality of the counterfactual method. It is not true. He uses it too, but he does not give it the value that increasingly in our system that are not yet well equipped in terms of the data culture, it is the easiest learning tool. Here there are actual schools. What are these schools in Italy? There is a school which derives its background from the Bocconi school, and I'd like to mention one as an example. I'm just sharing this Chavazzi. And there is a school in the area of Venice and Trento, and here I can mention Mr. Trivellato. And there is a reality here in Rome, which refers to the Lewis School, where assessment there is linked to an institutional approach. And then there is also another school or another movement in the area of Turin. And they try to reconcile different approaches and sensitivities. So in this little territory that is Italy compared to the United States, there are different approaches and attitudes, but there is a convergence point similar to the convergence point in the US, where we can certainly put together the University of Maryland with the institutions Professor Besharov mentioned earlier on, that is answering a common question. So asking the right question is the element of unity, because tools can change over time, but the question is more important than the answer, because it allows everyone to give a contribution, a serious contribution, and this can make a difference. So before leaving for an international mission with the Speaker of the Senate, I would like to extend his greetings. When we say that the Senate of the Republic would like to keep analyzing public policies, the first element of clarification with our president is, but yes, but in concrete terms, what do you do? This is his answer. So in concrete terms, we serve, we provide our service. We are not the owner of the knowledge. We steal, we get hold of Professor Besharov, and we steal through our ears and eyes and our mind the most refined thoughts in the academic world. We establish an institutional network. Please allow me to say that your presence here is emblematic, because you represented the Parliament, the auditor's account, the Constitutional Court. So your presence here is a gift for me, and I wish to thank you publicly. Gives the meaning of our work. We are not individual stakeholders. We serve the interests of everyone else. Thank you so much again.
se sono ovviamente disponibile comprensibilmente con i saluti per qualsiasi domanda di qualsiasi genere. Altrimenti voi... Ok. I will repeat.
I'm available to any questions you may have.
While you are thinking about questions, or as you're leaving, let me mention that our class studies indicators.
Indicators.
Oh, yes, as well as counterfactuals.
One thing that we stressed earlier in our studies this week was the idea of external validity, ensuring that impact evaluation not only takes into account differences between populations that are being studied, but also observing other impact evaluations done by other organizations and whether or not they're applicable to your relevant populations. For example, when we were speaking with UNICEF, they also mentioned their Progresa Mexico, and there were significant differences when they were speaking about implementation evaluations in Africa, who had taken up the cash transfer programs. So my question to you is, what do you believe the role of specifically government or the Italian Senate, what is their role in interpreting sort of foreign or sort of outside of the country impact evaluations, and secondarily, does it have a responsibility in preparing its own evaluation? Does it have a responsibility to its partners, say within the EU and in the broader global community, in establishing and determining external validity for those communities as well?
Let me add to his question to make it maybe a little. Yeah. So you are now doing the fact-finding committee on the job safety. So maybe put your comments because I know you're thinking about that, maybe put your answer in the context of what you're doing for the fact-finding committee.
Sicuramente l'elemento della condizionalità nell'assegnare le
The element of conditionality in allocating resources is quite important, but I would also mention a difference between resources provided by international bodies or international organizations compared to what can be developed inside the country. And if I understood the question correctly, also the development of assessments about what other countries do at the European level. This is a role that, in my opinion, should be played at the EU level, in the EU administrations, rather than by a government, an Italian government body, unless we think in terms of the design which can be made upstream a performance program. For instance, as if Italians participate in designing a new recovery fund, we may discuss about the indicators or about the parameters which may be used for the assessment later on. And if in the implementation of the plan, Italy will monitor the indicators of some resources used in other countries, in my opinion, this is less possible. Even though the EU framework starts from the concept of a peer review across member countries at the EU level. With respect to the reasoning about what are the indicators or the profiles of interest? In my opinion, there is no opposition between indicators and the assessment of public policies. The indicator is the result of the public policy. So if we say that the goal of the public policy is to reduce the number of accidents on the job, we need to measure those accidents, and the indicator has to be those accidents on the job. We cannot think that the indicator for that policy is just the correlation between public contracts and the number of accidents on the job. So first of all, it is necessary to measure the phenomenon that is regulated by policymakers. Then we can add other analysis profiles. The example I gave was we can imagine what could be the elements that are distinctive in a public activity or a public or private activity that affect the target indicator of our policy. In this case, the explanation might be, I wish to understand whether the subcontract or a company that wins a public tender to build a bridge and then they delegate to a smaller company the building of a part of that bridge. I need to check whether this subcontracting can cause the increase in the number of accidents. So the reason might be that the smaller company has fewer resources for on-the-job safety, whereas the bigger company has a security department, so they have more education for the staff. And we know that on-the-job safety depends on the training of the staff, whereas for the smaller company, they have a turnover of workers and a higher number of cases. So if we find this correlation, we are not providing an answer to the policy question. Because there, the first question was, how can I reduce the number of accidents of the job? The explanation is you should focus on smaller companies. And what can be done later will require further assessment processes. In the assessment process, understanding the understanding process which underlies the question must start from the incentives moving the economic behaviors of subjects. Unless we understand those incentives moving economic behaviors, we cannot act as mediators. We should be mediators between the policy question and the assessment. I think that the question I would ask the assessors, and I hope I can ask this question shortly, will be, can we find a legal formula? Because the connection between the legal formula and the formal analysis of the impact are not opposed, they are connected. So the legal logic should be build a joint responsibility for the contracting company and the subcontractor, that the smaller company that builds the little part of the public work.
Di capacità delle imprese.
So basically, we have to extend the ability of the larger company and their ability to create safety on the job, to extend that even to the smaller subcontractor. Now, how we go about doing that is part of the our juridical background and the impact evaluation. And if we continue, we can discuss this further. And I can even continue with further examples if you wish.
No.
Okay. Thank you for the presentation. It's very interesting. My question, so something I think that the Secretary General also mentioned was that the goal of public policy evaluation is to raise awareness of the consequences of a policy and not to impact policymakers. But something Professor Besharov mentioned after was that, at least in the United States and elsewhere as well, you might have a liberal policy analysis, conservative, moderate, leftist, whatever, and the implicit goal of having these policy analyses is political and is to impact policymakers. And so, to me, I guess coming at it from an American perspective, philosophically, it seems a little, I guess, unrealistic to not expect politicalization. And so I was just wondering how you, I guess, attempt to combat bias and politics and policy analysis, because that's something that seems somewhat inherent to policy analysis.
Well, thank you for the question, and it's a very interesting and stimulating question at that. There's a first step, I think, which needs to be taken. Now, when I said that the Senate can be a mediator of sorts vis-a-vis the external evaluation and the decision makers' actions, and of course that also touches upon the quality of the policy's evaluation. It's certainly true that anything can be proved, and with the use of data, with the use of analysis models, you can almost prove anything. But we also have to understand whether or not the analysis has been set up correctly. Sometimes you can prove certain things by using analyses which aren't exactly foolproof from the scientific point of view. And secondly, when an analysis is scientifically solid, say you have 10 analyses which say 10 different things, and we can scrap 5 of them because they're not scientifically sound. Whereas for the other 50%, we can actually try to understand what hypotheses they're based on. We can try to understand the bias of the analysis based on the hypotheses made. That has to be made explicit. When I mentioned that we have to make our analysis model and its outcomes transparent, we also have to understand what hypotheses we're building on, because we have to understand that with different hypotheses we would come up with different outcomes. So we don't have to deny the evaluation, because we know that we can have different outcomes based on the same evaluation. What we have to do is we have to support the decision maker. We have to allow them to understand the various hypotheses of the various options they have and the possible outcomes they may have. Obviously, none of us have perfect knowledge. We don't have the possibility of understanding or of predicting outcomes, because anything is based on individual behavior. These models always have an intrinsic level of uncertainty. They aren't truth. And that's something that we have to convey to decision makers. We have to tell them we're not conveying absolute truth. We're simply conveying a model which has a certain degree of uncertainty within it, and it's just a way of helping them. And I know we're running a little late, so I'll leave it at that. But governments conduct risk analyses, and it's very interesting to think about, because it actually sets up priorities based on risk assessments. Think of natural catastrophes. Think of the earthquakes we have in Italy. And we're also extending that to floods and extreme weather events. And therefore, we have to focus on infrastructure, and we have to be able to give priority to those parts of the country where you can have larger damage in terms of victims or in terms of damage to our economic system. Again, these are risk analyses. They aren't the truth. Then, of course, you can have extreme weather events in an unexpected place, and our risk assessment did not protect us from victims and from economic disasters. So we simply have to convey information to our decision makers. I'm afraid we've run out of time. I do hope we'll have other opportunities to meet again and to receive any other questions. And please feel free to send them in by email maybe. And thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to interact with all of you. And thank you very much, Professor, of course.